My Lords, it's a privilege to follow the noble Lord. With 28 years' experience in local government and 8 years on the Board of Transport for London, I have long had a very strong interest in procurement. And I'm delighted that so many noble Lords have an equally strong interest in procurement, though it is somewhat dispiriting that so many members have strayed off into using this bill as yet another opportunity to roll out a number of anti-capitalist themes and proposals that no doubt will reappear at committee stage and then duly be taken out by a sensible government when it returns to another place. My question really was a rather more radical one than most noble Lords have raised so far, which is whether we actually need this bill at all. We do need, of course, to scrap the EU regulations, but do we need to replace them at all? The history of the EU regulations is that in large parts of Europe, and I say this without specifying any particular parts, there was a history of municipal corruption and the award of contracts in a non-transparent and corrupt way. And it was right that we should tackle that as a single European community while we were a member of it. It was also the case that the European Union saw these regulations as a means of forcing the development of a single market. Well, we are no longer a member of the single market, so that consideration is not relevant to us. But when it comes to municipal corruption, I'm going to be so bold as to say that in this country we have been remarkably free of it. There have, in my lifetime, been a few very significant cases, but very, very few. We are very fortunate. We have an enviable record of a lack of corruption in public bodies. And I was expecting at this point to be jeered at in the wake of the remarks by the noble Lord Strasburger, but even if the allegations made and hinted at by the noble Lord were all vindicated, the remedy for them would lie in the criminal law and not in this bill, because we have a full panoply of criminal law that deals with municipal and public body corruption. We have laws against the taking of bribes. We have laws criminal laws against misconduct in public office. And that is where we should look for remedies to the sort of corruption that these regulations were originally intended to deal with, rather than, in my view, to this bill itself, which is almost irrelevant. And indeed, the weakness of the bill in relation to remedies has already been pointed out by other noble lords, particularly Lord Thomas of Cumgead. So I asked myself, why do we not simply scrap, and my noble friend can explain this later, why do we not simply scrap the existing regulations, rely on the criminal law as we used to before we joined the European Union, and then perhaps such an esteemed body such as the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accountants could issue a good practice note on how local authorities should comply with our international obligations. Is anything more than that actually needed? Now, my Lords, the bureaucratisation of honesty, which is what we are actually discussing here, has led over recent years to the creation of what I call a sort of a high priesthood of procurement. People who are dedicated to the process, this is a process bill, dedicated to the process of honesty rather than to its substance, and who, having got the grip of the process of procurement, often refuse to let go of it, even though everyone can see, including them quite often, that the procurement process is leading to a disaster. So I would hope that this bill would at least be drafted in such a way as to avoid the pitfalls of the current system. And I thought that I would illustrate, I know there have been some war stories, but I'll take the opportunity perhaps to add a few of my own. I would illustrate what I'm saying by some of the procurement, by some war stories of my own. You see, very fortunately for me, back in the 1990s, a very wise council officer said to me, "Do you know," he said, "do you know, I can get any result I want out of a procurement process, because the secret, he said, Councillor Moylan, the secret is in how you set up the conditions by which the process is going, by which the final decision is going to be made. So what conditions do you set up? And the whole system rests on that. Just a few examples. I know of one public procurement project for services which allocated 40% of the points to what was called project compatibility. And when I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, it means we can choose whoever it is we want to work with because they'll be compatible with us. On another occasion, we were choosing, now here I was not involved early on, so I didn't have a chance to shape the conditions. I was brought in to sit on an architectural panel. It was an architectural procurement, not a construction procurement, an architectural procurement for a major public building. And when we decided, having interviewed the various architects and seen their proposals, when we decided which one we wanted, we were actually told by local government officers who'd brought their own lawyers to control us that we couldn't have them because they didn't meet the criteria. We asked what criteria they weren't meeting. Financial stability. 35% of the points had been given without anyone being consulted to the financial stability. My lords, financial stability is important in some contracts. But if you choose a one-man architecture practice to build something for you and he goes bankrupt, you just rehire him. There is no consideration of financial stability when it comes to procuring services like that. But we ended up with the architect we didn't want because we'd left it all too late. I then want to come to the question of the new iconic bus shelter for London. Noble lords will notice that there is no such thing as a new iconic bus shelter for London. This was something I engaged with TfL before I joined the board. And I said we should have a new iconic bus shelter for London because they're dreadful. They're absolutely appalling. And Peter Hendy, who was then Commissioner of Transport for London, was good enough to agree that something should be done. So we set up jointly, I was representing London councils at the time, we set up jointly a process in which we invited architects to submit proposals for this wonderful thing, and TfL officers ran it as a procurement process. So 20 of them appeared. We had these wonderful designs. Actually, some of them were so extravagant that they could never have been used, but we had a large number of designs put to us, and a design panel put in place in order to make the architectural judgments, only to discover at the end of the presentations that we weren't allowed to take design into account, because the TfL officers had actually used the procurement, the branch of the procurement process which you would use if you were buying a piece of air conditioning plant. And so it was entirely to be judged on specification of its, whether it kept the rain out and things like that. So the entire purpose of the exercise was defeated through a misapplication of the procurement process, and all of us agreed, exhausted by that point, that basically we'd abandon it and come back to it, and you know we never did. So London still has a wide variability and a high level of ugliness in relation to when you come to look at its bus shelters. Now these revelations may shock noble lords, I don't know, but they would not shock anybody who was engaged in public procurement in most other European Union countries, because they are perfectly well aware that most European Union legislation is written with a high degree of rigidity as far as the words are concerned, and a high degree of flexibility as far as the application is concerned. Reference was made earlier to our gold plating things. It's not that we gold plate them, it's that we take them seriously in a way that other countries don't. So my worry, to my noble friend, is very simply this. We are quite rightly getting rid of a set of regulations that do not work for us and were designed for circumstances that don't apply to us. But instead of taking the radical approach of asking, well, what was the point of them in the first place and do we need them, we are in very great danger, it seems to me, of replicating them, but with an English touch, a British touch. Sorry, I shouldn't say English, because I welcome very much. I've just spoken after the noble Lord Wigley, and I should have said earlier how delighted we all are that Wales has joined in this great corporate endeavour, but that we simply put a local touch, a national touch on them, but we end up with the same problems. We are still doing obeisance to the high priesthood of procurement, and we will find that we are no further forward, and we certainly won't be dealing with allegations of corruption because, as I say, those are still going to be dealt with effectively under the criminal law.